I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you. It's really an agonizing moment right now for many of us, and I appreciate the opportunity to come together and shift our focus for an hour to a wonderful creative endeavor, which is the unique new book, The Bund, A Graphic History of Jewish Labor Resistance. I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Workers' Circle Arbeiterring of Northern California, who both suggested today's event and helped provide financial support for it. And I want to thank our co-presenters, the fabulous Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco and CLES, California. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do possible, and particularly now that the library is independent. I hope you consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Also note that it will butcher names and any Yiddish words. To give you an overview of today's program, we'll begin with historical reflections from the book's editor, Paul Buhle. Paul is a retired senior lecturer at Brown University, whose books include Jews and American Comics, an illustrated history of an American art form, From the Lower East Side to Hollywood, Jews in American Popular Culture, and Yiddishkeit, Jewish Vernacular in the New Land. We'll then have a visually rich presentation by Sharon Rudahl and Michael Kluckner on the book itself. Sharon is a longtime figure in the modern cartoon art movement and was one of the artists who established women's comics in the early 1970s. Her books include Ballad of an American, a graphic biography of Paul Robeson, and A Dangerous Woman, the graphic biography of Emma Goldman. Michael is an award-winning Canadian writer and artist whose books include Vancouver the Way It Was, Vanishing Vancouver, Paving Paradise, and British Columbia in Watercolor. After the presentation, there will be ample opportunity for questions and answers. Because of the size of this group, we will stick to submitting questions in written form through the chat function, which you're invited to do, and then I'll relay those questions to our presenters. So Paul, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I want to speak very briefly now because we'll cover much of the material in a few minutes. The most important thing to say about the Bund is that it was an international movement. It sought socialism. It sought to maintain and create a continued growing interest in Yiddish and Yiddishkeit, which is not exactly like speaking Yiddish, but rather making it into a language and a culture that was already shared by the members of the Bund themselves, primarily in Eastern Europe. Now, I want to mention before we begin, this book here, for anyone who wants to pursue this subject further, it's by Frank Wolf with 2 F's at the end, Yiddish Revolutionaries in Migration, the Transnational History of the Jewish Labor Bund. I only want to press one point for us to think of as we go through this program, and that is he refutes previous views, previous scholarship, suggesting that the Bund was outdated and the upward mobility of Jews, especially in the Western countries, made its socialistic Yiddishist origins archaic and unimportant. As this book clarifies, the Bund was a vital international organization with rich ties that stretch from Eastern Europe, and particularly Poland, to Argentina, to North America, with vital activities in all those places and others. What Frank Wolf stresses is that for the Bund, collective memory, which he calls memoric, has been vital, was vital as a sensibility, the belief in collective memory, not only sharing the memory, but reviving the memory, not just the facts of the memory, but the sentiment and feeling of what the Bund had been through, its suffering and its joys, celebrated, as you can see in the comic, through songs and dancing and poetry, quite as much through a literal telling of the history. So those are very vital things, and they give you a sense of the vitality of the Bund as an international movement, and why indeed we urgently need its values today. Now I'll turn it over to the next speaker, who I think perhaps is our slide presenter, Michael Kluckner, an artist.
Thank you, Paul. What I'm going to do is advance the slides, and Sharon Rudahl, who wrote this wonderful book, is going to speak to them, and I may chip in a little bit from there.
Please do chip in whenever you can. Okay, well, this is the cover of the book. Should we move on to the interior?
Let me just make this thing move. There, oops, hang on. There we are there.
Well, the first thing I want to say is I didn't know anything about the Bund when I started working on this, and I had never written a script for another artist. Paul Buhle contacted me because an older woman artist in her upper 80s had this project in mind for many years and done sketches and research and found a publisher. And then she felt it was just too much for her to handle. So I was asked to help. So I pulled myself together and did what I could to get started. And then she dropped out of the project completely. And the Canadian publisher found Michael. So Michael and I, babes in the woods, having no idea what we were doing, tried to uncover what we needed to know about the Bund. So to begin the story, I wanted to place it in geography, where the Jewish Pale was located within the Russian Empire. And just when I was starting to work on this is when the Russian Empire decided it was going to try to take back Ukraine. And I think that definitely firmed up my sense of the necessity of the Bund and made me more aggressive than I would have been in my portrayal of the evil of the time. On to the next slide, please. Okay. Oh, so here we have the Bund cake being eaten by, I believe it's Franz Joseph. My younger son asked me, "Does the Bund have anything to do with Bund cake?" And I said, "Oh, I doubt if it possibly could." We looked it up, and indeed, it is the same word. Bund cake is made up of pieces that go together to make something delicious, and the Bund was something that put workers and revolutionaries and thoughtful Jews and Jewish artists and poets together to make something wonderful. Do you want to chime in on any of these first couple pages, Michael? No? You're okay? All right. Is there anything you wanted to say about it before we move on? We're not hearing Michael.
Forward.
Go forward. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. Okay, here we have the iconic Cossacks attacking and burning a village. I was trying to paint in words a portrait of why the Jews were in the situation they were in, that they could only live in certain places, that they could only occupy certain professions, not remunerative ones like being tailors or money changers, and that they were the put to blame by the authorities whenever there was a plague or a crop failure or anything to complain about. The Jews were blamed, and then vengeance was taken upon them. So I wanted people to understand that situation before we moved on with the specifics of the Bund. Next slide, please. All right, the founding of the Bund in Vilna. Vilna, in what is now Lithuania, is where the first founders of the Bund lived and came together and met. And let's see, I'll read their names at some point. Okay, which is the next slide? Next slide. Here we go. So I have to read that from my book due to my terrible vision. Let's see if I can do that. It's everyone should hear them. Patty Kramer, and we're going to learn more about her. She was one of the characters that I was able to find out enough about to really appreciate her story. Arkady Kramer, John Mill, Mikhail Lieber, Julie Martov, Noah Portnoy, Vladimir Kosovsky, Anna Heller, and Isaiah Izinschat. I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sure. Isaiah Izinschat. Okay, on to the next slide. And they met in an attic and discussed, these are progressive, educated Jews that knew that the situation was terrible and that something had to be done. And they met and made plans so they could form an organization. Okay, and there's Patty Kramer in the upper left-hand corner, being a delightful young woman with butterflies and flowers. And it was said of her that she just seemed like an innocent and sweet young person, but in fact, she was incredibly dedicated and hardworking and brave. She was a dental student, and where she did dentistry was actually used as a meeting place to pass on when there was going to be a strike or when somebody had to be boosted out of jail or whatever. She was used as a cover, and she volunteered at trying to teach young Jewish working women how to read so they could be literate and have some control over their lives. She got a lot of pushback from Jewish families, not just from the authorities, that felt if their daughters became literate, that then they wouldn't be able to fit into the mold of their family obligations and that they would be dissatisfied. Next page. Next slide. New slide. Can we get a new slide?
We've lost Michael's voice.
We lost Michael's voice.
Yeah, we're not sure why, but have you got the next slide there? Anyway.
Okay. Did you want to say anything about the last few?
No, other than have you got my, yes, you have got my voice there. I can see that now.
Yeah.
Other than I think the extraordinary thing about these people, and this comes through in the book, is how often they were arrested, how often they were banished to other places, how often they had to make their way back. And so it's not like this is just a completely linear story, that these people come and go, and particularly Patty Kramer and one other person that we're going to see a little bit later on. They really have very adventurous lives that required a lot of resilience on their part to do what they're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, they were really heroic. So here I'm trying to explain a little bit about the mother tongue, about the importance of Yiddish as a lingua franca of Jews all over the world. And I understand we have in our audience the artist and writer Trina Robbins, who actually, she and her Yiddish class helped provide the actual Yiddish that I used to put in the book, because I really don't know anything except a few choice names for the people in Congress. And here they're saying the joke about why did the chicken cross the road? But people are able to say it across oceans and understand each other because they're speaking in Yiddish. And how Yiddish was so important for tying Jewish communities together all over the world, and for creating the Yiddish kind of Jewish poetry and music and plays and films, that the Yiddish was the language in which they were able to communicate to the rest of the Jewish community. Now, of the new ideas that was taking hold in the misery of the Russian Empire at that time, there was nationalism, there was communism, there was the Western Enlightenment, there was many different ideas competing for attention. And one of them was Zionism, which held out that Hebrew would be the language of free Jews, that if Jews really wanted to be an independent people that were treated with respect, they should go back to their old language. And that was a real battle between the Yiddishists and the Hebraists. But anyways, the Bund came down firmly on the side of Yiddish as our language. And when families would argue about this, they would say, oh, Yiddish is street language. Yiddish is something for, working people. It's not something to write literature or to write politics. You have to turn to Hebrew for. Hebrew was, I think in a way it was like Latin in Europe in the Middle Ages. Hebrew was a language, an educated ancient language of Jews that had more respect than Yiddish. Yiddish had no respect, but it had everything else. Yeah, can I see what the next slide is? We can't hear Michael. Can we hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can we tell Michael to turn slides to go to a new slide?
I think he hears us, but he can't get through. You'll have to lean closer in, Michael.
For some reason or another, my slideshow has frozen here too. So there we go.
Okay. All right. So here we're starting to see some of the, it says, nevertheless, Bundists would not abandon their mother tongue, lands where they had lived for centuries, their struggle for civil rights, the rich, unique culture Jews had created under oppression. And we see them dancing the hora to presumably to klezmer music. And at this point, I think we get to Mainua Platz now. Can we do that? Okay. So this is something I drew, I think it's like more than 30 years ago, 40 years ago, not knowing it was a Bund poem. It's by the Moses Rosenfeld, who was one of the most esteemed Bund poets. And I knew it only because a friend had given me a record of klezmer music as a birthday present in the 70s. And I fell in love with the song and learned to sing it, not well. And it's a Bund poem. And I will now, if you don't mind bad singing and worse Yiddish, I will regale you with at least a verse of it so that you can hear what it sounds like. Nik zoek mich wo die Märten grünen, gefinst mich dorten nicht mein Schatz. Wo Lebenswelken bei Maschinen, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Dorten ist mein Ruheplatz, and so forth. There's so much soul in the poem and in the music that it sustained me through many years without even knowing that it came from the Bund. All right, ready to move on? Okay, let's see where we are now.
I think we probably should save half an hour for discussion. So if we can move through the slideshow in the next 10 minutes, it would
Okay,
be.
let's just do the slideshow then. Okay, you can just quickly flip through them. Just give me 5 seconds with each one or so, 10 seconds with each one. We can just go through. There's various meetings of the Bund. Here's the diaspora. As things got worse in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, more and more Jews felt forced to leave and formed communities in the New World that maintained their contact with other Bund members and maintained Bund culture. Bund newspapers, Bund theaters, Bund schools continue. And here we have the 1917 revolution. The Bolsheviks seized control. The Bundists were actually very important in the preliminary planning for the 1905 revolution and then later the 1917 revolution. Their politics were closer to that of the Mensheviks than the Bolsheviks, and they were very much outmaneuvered by Lenin. But they still supported the revolution in every way. Next slide. And here we see, okay, so after the revolution, there started to be more and more anti-Semitism in Europe, the rise of Hitler. The Bundists bravely held out and fought where they could. And some left, some were killed, some continued to support, were able to fight as partisans. But basically, much of the Bund in Eastern Europe was wiped out, though it remained strong in Poland through the war. Next slide. And now this is the other character that I have some specific stories about. Bernard Goldstein was a legendary Bund shapeshifter and revolutionary, and he dressed up as a rabbi to get people out of the Warsaw ghetto, and he got food and medicine into places where nobody else could, and performed amazing feats. He always had ties with the underworld, so when he was jailed, he had supporters who could break him out again, and improbably he managed to escape both Hitler and Stalin's agents to make it to the U.S. and die peacefully in bed. So may we all be so fortunate and so brave. Next slide. And this is Patty Kramer. Was able to come, had been in France after being in exile as a revolutionary, came back to work in Eastern Europe, and then was taken away with other women to a concentration camp where she died. And it's reliably reported by eyewitnesses that she led the women in the song that was the Bund anthem as they were driven to the camps. And I believe that's just about our end, or are there a few more slides? Okay, the branch of Jewish culture identified and nurtured by the Bund, secular, humane, activist, was not exterminated. It survived transplant across continents. So I think that's the end of what I want to say. If you want to move on and talk about some of your pages, Michael, I think that's a good place for me to end.
We're having trouble again with hearing you, Michael.
Okay. Well, this is the Russian army crushing Muslims as well as Jews in parts of the empire that were like Chechnya and so forth, that were Muslim areas. And there's some parts we didn't go over about how dreadful life was in the center of the Russian Empire, even for Russians by birth. The serfs were barely more than slaves and completely unable to improve their conditions at all. Led short, miserable lives. We still can't hear poor Michael.
It was frozen again. I don't know why. Okay, now I think I've got volume there. You can hear me now. I'm seeing my microphone go up.
Again.
Okay, but the slideshow has frozen. This is really annoying. I'm very sorry, everybody, with this. There we go. Okay, so just a few things about working on this book. It was really wonderful to work in color in the book and to be able, with Between the Lines Publishing, to be able to publish this in color with all of the support that we had from people that Paul arranged. And so in painting what were effectively black and white ink drawings, that I used a much more muted palette. I kind of dubbed it the poverty palette for the scenes involving the peasants, the Bundists, the Jews in Eastern Europe, and then really brightened the palette up into blues, reds, and golds for people like our old friend here, the Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary. You know, and a few other things there was in Sharon's script, it talked about how the aristocrats really lived off the forced sweated labor of people in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and so on. And so I did this one here of where the labor of this man working on a machine is sort of supporting the coif of the woman at a dancing engagement in Russia at that time. Maps. Sharon alluded to this right at the beginning. I think that historical geography is really important. I think increasingly as we live in an internet world, including our talk today, where we're spread all over effectively the North American continent, that young people aren't getting a sense of the geography, where things happen. And I think it's very important. And so we've drawn a lot of maps in this and cartooned them a little bit. But for example, I think most people know that the Western Front was this little area of France-Belgium that was fought over, but people are not aware that the Eastern Front was such almost like in a traditional war of cavalry and artillery and everything moving back and forth over really a vast swath of area, including, you'll see right in the middle there, of Kiev. So Ukraine took that in the First World War. And of course, again, in the Second World War. One of the nice things about the script to work with is that we kept coming back to places. And I think in a graphic novel, what you want to do is have some repeating images. And so the little printing press that the Vilna Group pioneers put together in order to print their socialist literature, we can have it on one page, and then a couple of pages later, we can have the thing smashed to bits and the people. So it just reinforces the images in people's minds.
I love your printing press, Michael. That was really impressed me.
It's fun.
It's old, but it's also very real, very three-dimensional. I really, really liked it.
Yeah, well, that's great. Just one thing, there's a double-page spread in it where it talks about how the Bund organizers became teachers, journalists, translators, musicians, actors, and so on. And the couple of men, the musicians at the bottom left-hand side, I took an image from a book on the Chernyavsky Trio, which is a book that I was involved with producing about 25 or 30 years ago. And the Chernyavsky brothers were born in Odessa, and they had a worldwide career from when they were little kids. This photo is about 1901. When they were sort of child sensations as a chamber trio, and they traveled all over the world. But two of the three of them married daughters of the man who owned the sugar refinery in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so the pianist Jan Chernyavsky, he lived out a very, very long life in Vancouver. His brother Michel lived in England with the other daughter, and then Leo was more of an interesting character, and he was in Australia and South Africa, and as he moved around. But I thought it was fun to be able to roll in the Chernyavskys again, and if you Google the Chernyavskys, I think you can find more about this really interesting group of young Russian Jewish boys who came out of the Pale. Sharon had Allen Ginsberg make an appearance at one of the Jewish cultural events, which I thought was great fun, and great fun to draw him. And then there are other things, and I think one of the real advantages, and I think one of the attractions of graphic novels for a younger audience, particularly, is that they can see how you play around with perspective, how you play around with images, how you can put these poor people being evacuated in the First World War, or I should say fleeing in the First World War from the front, across the Jewish Pale on the right-hand side, and then a couple of Russian soldiers, and in a sense, standing in for the whole Russian government, looking one way and finding that they're at war, but they're also at war with their own people. So, just one of the things that you can do in that. We had a little bit of fun with Tsar Nicholas and Rasputin on the left-hand side, and then when I was looking through for images, I found a woodblock print by a Japanese artist that was done at the time of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And this wonderful woodblock print showed the Tsar's nightmare of his military returning home as zombies, all defeated. And as you'll know, that Russia was really soundly trounced by Japan in 1905. Lots of opportunities to paint snow, and I guess painting snow is an oxymoron. You sort of leave the paper blank, but they were using the color and everything. It was great to be able to do this, and the beautiful reproduction job you could get, for example, that long blue winter shadow coming out behind the Bundesleader Noah Portnoy, who's escaping across from Siberia. Lots of fights, lots of demonstrations, lots of context in a sense of what people had to fight against. And just with a final kind of a village one with the three balls of the pawnbroker and what we're kind of imagining as being a Ukrainian and Polish village. And I will say thank you.
Well, thank you for bringing my words to life. I really appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome. Howard, Paul, and Sharon, I think I'll stop screen sharing at this point, and then we can get the dialogue going.
Very good.
Great. Okay, so I do have some questions that went directly to me, and I'll share those with the three of you. And then I want to invite anybody in the audience to use the chat to ask a question. It can go to everyone, or it can go just to me, and I'll relay those questions. So one was an informational one from Howard Shub asking what year the Bund was founded, how big it was at its height, and a third question, sorry, multiple questions, did it attract religious Jews at all?
Perhaps I can provide a little bit of an answer. I don't regard myself as a serious scholar of the Bund, but in 1997 at Cooper Union, nice big meeting. We celebrated the centenary. It was quite fabulous. It ended with a klezmer concert, even though I'm told klezmer music did not play a significant role in the Bund pre-1920. Nevertheless, it touched off a little boomlet of Bund activity, new Bund activity, which didn't last too long, but its leading figure was a fellow named Jack Jacobs, who's the singular scholar of the Bund, who I failed to mention, as someone mentioned it to me. If you want to know more about the Bund, look for his journal articles and his books. A couple other notes while I have the floor. The first one is that none of this could have been done without, between the lines, editor Amanda Crocker, who liked the idea from the very beginning, encouraged us in so many ways, including the use of color, and really made things possible. So she was great. A little further on, financially, it was made possible, that is to say, the payment of the artist by the Workmen's Circle of the Bay Area, Northern California, by the Workmen's Circle of Toronto, and also by an individual financial contributor, Jules Bernstein, who's a very important figure within Democratic Socialists of America, whereas I'm a minor figure within Democratic Socialists of America. I lastly want to say that for me and my generation, one single intellectual influence, savant guy, Ichi Goldberg, who when he died at age 103, got a great notice in the New York Times because he was the eldest person ever to have written a new book, a collection of essays that are pretty hard to read because his Yiddish is so wonderfully literary. But in a way, he's responsible indirectly for this. And I have to add also is the National Endowment for the Humanities, because they funded me for 2 years in the early 1980s to interview scores of aged, politically left-wing Yiddish speakers, coast to coast, and also helped me create the Oral History of the American Left archive at Temmelman Library, New York University. I'm told recently it's one of the most used archives at Temmelman, which is the labor library. So there's a back history, which of course includes many, many other people, especially the veterans of the Bund who held on, certainly through the 40s and 50s and 60s, but is also due to a certain number of us who made every effort to carry on the larger traditions of socialistic Yiddishkeit. All right, did I fail to answer some specific question which I've neglected?
I think there was the additional question of whether religious people were
Yes.
involved in the Bund.
It's a very good question, and because so much of this would have been shtetl by shtetl, it would be very difficult to answer. But as with Jews in struggling unions and others, the possibility of reaching people with a cultural situation, with a certain defense against pogroms, and a cultural community sensibility was larger than the insistence and centrality of Yiddishkeit. On the other hand, it was the purpose of the Bund to encourage people and bring them along. So would a religious person have felt uncomfortable? The last of my 3 vignettes is with Paul Pasek-Novak, who died at age 97 in the 1980s, having been an editor for 70 years. And he starts out in the shtetl in the Ukraine, and his parents hoped he would be a rabbi. Instead, he turned he joined the Bund and became a socialist. So it would certainly be the case in that generation that almost everyone in the Bund, without exaggerating too much, came from a religious background. And it would also be the case that for many people, the messianism that they learned in their community, in their family, and in the Cheder for many of them, they transferred to the socialist movement and lived their lives as if they were carrying on a grand and holy mission.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from Joel and Diana asking about whether if the Bund were active today still, what would it look like in terms of what would they be saying in today's world?
If I'll let me answer that first and pass it on to Sharon and Michael. First of all, the Bund was really, really, really international. And people in different continents were closely in touch with each other. The people in the US often supplied significant funds to the Eastern European movements, right from the 1890s onward. But they shared this sensibility across continents. And as this book on the Bund by Frank Wolf stresses, they, in a certain sense, relive the events of the first 20 years of the Bund. They re-experience them through a sort of collective memory. And although it doesn't seem like it meets the immediate political crises of the moment, the sensibility of renewing that memory of the old world, how people suffered and struggled and managed to hold on and to build something, that 140 years later, still for a Bundist would be important today, and the way they'd revive it would be in part through singing and maybe dancing. But they would wish to stress the continuity as opposed to something that began yesterday.
Thank you. So Margaret Levy asks about whether there was, sorry, I just disappeared, whether there was an organizational structure to the Bund with officers, et cetera, versus being a free-form voluntary grouping.
I wonder if that's directed to me or someone else. You know, of course, there were structures, and the structures were important, but among the points made by Frank Wolf is they did not idealize their leaders. It's hard to believe since their leaders were self-sacrificing, but they made a point of not idealizing their leaders, but regarding them as the foremost figures in the movement. So this business of who was the chair and who was the local director and all the sorts of things, which tends to be a matter of ego in every other movement of every other kind, that Bund considered differently, or at least they believed they considered it differently.
Then we have a question from Boris Kersansky, who points out the Bund was a socialist movement. How did their view, especially of the future for status for Jews, relate to the views of the Bolsheviks and or the Mensheviks?
Maybe Sharon, you want to speak to that?
Well, I can try. I'm not as knowledgeable about either history or politics as I should be. What Menshevik actually means minority, and Bolshevik means majority. And Lenin outmaneuvered them, the Bund, so that the Bolsheviks had bigger numbers than the Mensheviks when it came to voting for certain decisions about how they would proceed. I would say the Bund struggled with at various times with the issue of tactics. They renounced terror in the sense of assassinations and bombings and so forth. They never would have said, you know, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. The means and the ends had to be coherent with each other. That's part, to me, I mean, my feeling of the Bund is it's an awful lot like a John Lennon song rather than anything that actually could exist in the real world. But for me, it really made me much more comfortable with my Judaism. I always just felt like, you know, I am Jewish. I've experienced anti-Semitism. I've gone and grown up with certain cultural, food, music, whatever that makes me a Jew, but I'm not religious. I'm a left-wing person. What does that mean? Well, studying the Bund, I found, that means I'm part of a huge group of Jews that goes back many generations. It's not just my own goofy ideas, where there's lots of us that believe this. You know, where do we go with that? What can we do with it? Just tell me, you know, I don't know, but I think the world needs it now more than ever.
Thank you. So I have a question from Elaine Ellenson, who notes that the book highlights Patty Kramer, and she asks, what was the role of women in the Bund? In the leadership, in the more underground revolutionary tasks? Did they have to defy their families?
They did have to defy their families in many cases, but I think it was a central tenet of the Bunds to treat women with as much equality as possible and to extend through literacy and whatever various rights, to extend their liberty in the world, make it possible for them to do more. That was one of the real basic Bund principles.
I guess to that, I would add that every left-wing movement that I know of through history, especially every left-wing movement based on the working class or the lower classes, has both depended totally upon women doing an enormous amount of work at the branch level and not getting nearly so much credit the further we move up into the leadership. I think it was something unusual in Jewish Russian or Jewish Eastern European society, that among the first martyrs, the assassins of high Russian officials, and the visionaries who based their lives on reading Russian revolutionary literature, always included significant numbers of women, far more so than, let's say, standard labor movements, including the US labor movement, which didn't lack for heroines. But there was something about the romanticism of the Bund struggle, which brought heroic, self-heroized women forward to do these incredibly dramatic things and often be imprisoned or killed for them. Everything that Sharon says is true, getting women to educate themselves so that they wouldn't be pulling the movement backward, so they wouldn't be pulling their children backward, and so forth. Those things are very true. It would be difficult to demonstrate in the Bund movements across the continents, from Eastern Europe to North America to Argentina, that women played an equal role in the leadership. I don't think anyone would make that claim.
I'd like to add that, again, this is just my own experience and what I've perceived rather than actual scholarly knowledge. But it seems to me that Eastern European Judaism, women have a different position than in other societies, in that scholarship was prioritized as the most important thing. The man would, in the ideal family of a religious Jewish family, the man would devote himself to study and prayer, and the woman would have to earn a living, so that women inherently were more practical and capable than in any other culture that I know of. And I think, I mean, that certainly continued up to my youth, that Jewish women were a lot more uppity and ornery than women in any other culture that I knew.
Fair point.
We got a question about what the Bund's approach to Zionism was.
Well.
We had to do it, didn't we? Totally negative.
This would inevitably appear. It's interesting, in the Ukraine in particular, had the largest, most important anarchist movement in Eastern Europe, really the most important in Europe until the Spanish Civil War. And consequently, there are different sides conflicting. And the Bund was only one of them, and Zionism was only one of them, Bolshevism was only one of them, and anarchism was only one of them. And if the anarchists were the least Jewish of these movements, that by no means were they unpopular among Jews. So amidst this wild competition for interest and commitment, the Bund looked upon Zionists as negative in two respects. First, they thought Jews could be liberated only by removing themselves to the Middle East. And second, that they believed that Yiddish was, as Sharon said, an unworthy language. It was most common to say, and Rosa Luxemburg's family said it too, it must be admitted, Yiddish was what the serving girl spoke. It wasn't deserving of being lifted up. Now,
quote from I.L. Peretz that I think really covers this question. Quote, Zionism cannot be the solution for the whole Jewish people. We have grown in the diaspora, and the diaspora is our battlefield. We do not run away from the battlefield.
I think that's very good. Even the founders of the Jewish socialist movement in the US, like Abe Kahan, editor of the Forward, they believed Yiddish was only a transitional language, if people would assimilate and speak English. And in one way or another, those people were the predominant intellectuals until just about the turn of the century. And not until the Chernovitz Conference of 1907 did the sensibility of Yiddishists and their belief in Yiddish literature and Yiddish culture as being a fully developed culture of the Jewish people internationally really crystallize. An elderly guy who'd been a teacher in the schools, Yiddish schools in the 1910s, said to me that the older generation, which mostly lived uptown in Manhattan, they really looked down upon the Yiddish-speaking branches of the socialist movement because they mostly spoke English, and they could speak in German, and of course they could speak in Yiddish, but they didn't wish to. And it was only in the 1910s that various socialistic movements in education, from the Poal, the labor Zionists, who at that time split their interest between Yiddish and Hebrew, and the Yiddishists around the Yiddish Socialist Federation, and indeed those who would become communists and read the Freiheit, the very literate newspaper of the Communist Party. Only but that new generation did an urgency for Yiddish become central in many ways and carry itself forward through the incredibly popular Broadway, Yiddish Broadway of the 1920s and 1930s, with salaries as high as regular Broadway and fabulous stars, but also this web of Yiddish schools and Yiddish choruses, which played a vital role in popular culture and were hugely popular in various parts of the country. And Yiddish poets would step on the stage and read their poetry, and people would cry and throw them. Women would throw themselves at them. They were fabulous cultural figures within life. As I interviewed a few people whose fathers had brought these people to Los Angeles or someplace else. It's a culture we can hardly imagine now, but it sustained itself until the Second World War, the forced assimilation that took place of all immigrants in the U.S. and the news of the Holocaust and the decision made in Israel against a common use of Yiddish. So it's hard to imagine today, but the sensibility that the Bund held out at the center, that through Yiddish, through the survival of Yiddish and Yiddishkeit, the Jewish people had something special, something international, something socialistic that they couldn't have in any other way.
Thank you. So this is a question for Sharon and Michael, a question about the use, both of you have been involved in sort of using the cartoon format to forward nonfiction stories. And I'm curious about your own, how you got to that point in your career and what you think about comics as a vehicle for doing this kind of history or other nonfiction.
Well, I went to art school in New York, where incidentally I lived near 2nd Avenue and got to see all the old Yiddish theater signs were still painted up on the crumbling buildings. And Yiddishkeit was still very much alive there at that time in the 60s. But art school, art wasn't alive and stories weren't alive. It was black canvases and white canvases and minimal art, and everything I thought being an artist would be. That the gallery scene was just, it was rich people finding something they wanted to invest in, and artists coming up with some shtick, to use another good Yiddish word, that they could sell to the rich people. And I knew there were comics, but it never occurred to me that comics was an art form. Then later, when I was working on underground newspapers, Trina Robbins approached me. She wanted to make an all-women's comic, and I had been being an illustrator for an anti-Vietnam War newspaper. And she said, "Well, do you like to draw comics?" And I suddenly realized, well, of course I'd like to draw comics. And it was what I'd been looking for. It was something from the street. I mean, in a way, it's a lot like with the Bundesfil about Yiddish. It was a medium of the people. It was a medium that wasn't fussy. Oh, did I do something to mess things up? I just said Zoom here. I bumped this. Hold on, I'm going to get set up again.
You're okay.
You're fine.
Okay. It's on. All right. Anyways, I think in a way my love of comics is similar to the love of Yiddish in the Bund Society, that it's something that it isn't fancy and it isn't only for aristocrats. Comic books were cheap. Comic books came out quickly, just like underground newspapers. You could do it one day and people would read it in the streets the next. You could drop it at a demonstration and people would run over it and pick it up and they could still read it. And, I haven't looked back. It's a medium that is very stretchable and fungible, and you can use it for all different things. It's dying in a way. I mean, when the graphic novel came along as something that the New York Times would write reviews about, they also were sucking the life out of it and making it a zombie. Now that it's considered a serious art form, it probably doesn't have much more time to run. I'll leave it to younger generations to find a medium that's despised that they can make art out of. But I've had a good run. I've been able to do things with it that I never would have been able to do otherwise. That's what I have to say about me in comics. I'm sorry.
I guess I want to add that I've been a great fan of Sharon since the early 1970s. And one of the joys of me producing about 20 graphic novels here since 2005, when I first enrolled her to do a few pages on Emma Goldman for a comic on the centenary of the industrial workers of the world, was to see how wonderfully she worked and to work with her just as often as possible. Her work has been absolutely great. Don't be shy about it, Sharon. You've done fabulous work that can educate people into as long as people are going to read comics, nonfiction comics, they can read your comics and they'll learn a lot.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm still working for you too.
I know.
Yeah, Paul and I are working on a book about the resistance in Europe in World War II. I just doing it. It's a lot of artists doing short stories. I just finished a piece about Josephine Baker that I said, this is your swan song. Take your time, enjoy yourself. Don't be pressured by deadlines for a change. And I took a long, long time. And then when I finished, I said to myself, gee, that was fun. I'm not ready to stop. So now I'm doing some other things.
She's doing several pages anyway for the first biography of the famous English designer and socialist William Morris. So as long as I can collaborate with her, I'll continue to collaborate.
Michael, I think your microphone is not participating. There.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're not the ones that have the technical glitches. So can everybody still see me? It's just I can't be seen.
Yes.
The connections of this, I turned this on earlier because always with Zoom, you turn it on and they say, we have to install an update, so anyway, we didn't have to install an update. Just about drawing for graphic novels and comic books and things. I was a newspaper cartoonist in my 20s and working for the dailies for a while, and then got completely caught up in that 1981-82 recession, deep sort of economic recession that we had here, and switched gears and went into more fine art media, and particularly watercolor for doing book illustrations, and have done a number of books over the past 40 years that I'm very, very interested in heritage preservation, in the way that a landscape evolves and disappears, and all these things about change and memory and so on. And that's been a large part of my career. In about 2015, I actually met again my current publisher, not the Toronto Between the Lines, but a publisher in Vancouver who loved les bandes dessinées. He's from Montreal, and so that European and particularly French fascination with comic books. And I wanted to do a comic book, a graphic novel on the Japanese-Canadian internment during the Second World War. So, really absolutely parallel with what happened in the States, that all of the Japanese ancestry people, regardless of where they were born, were rounded up and forced off the coast, and a different sort of a situation in Canada. But I did that, and then that got me going on a couple of others, and a graphic novel on sort of the hippie 1970s. I lived in San Francisco in 1974, so I've got a tremendous amount of affection for it. What would we call this? Pre-Silicon Valley San Francisco, when you could sort of afford it. And then one day there was an email, and it was Between the Lines, and Paul and Sharon, and believe it or not, everybody, this is the first time that I have seen Sharon's face and Paul's faces on this Zoom talk. So this is really a 21st century sort of a book where we're doing it all electronically, and files are going back and forth, and so it was just a wonderful project. And as Sharon mentioned right at the beginning, that it just coincided so brilliantly with Russia invading Ukraine. And I thought, oh, good, an opportunity to get angry at Russia for doing all this. And so it's just been a great project, and learning a tremendous amount about the cultures and the languages and so on of Jewish people all over the world. So, thanks for making my microphone work.
So thank you. So we have a question from Art Persico. He asks, do the current political trends in this country make a potential reemergence of an American version of the Bund a good thing? Or are the concerns many of us here may feel about the rise of American fascism better addressed by existing American political organizations?
Oh gosh, that's impossible to answer, but I'll take a stab at it. There's so much that the history of the Bund as history, that vital history of 800 years of Jews speaking Yiddish in Europe and developing a very unique culture, which has brought forth so many aspects from entertainment to serious literature to everything else that one could imagine, great art and so forth, all coming from that legacy of Yiddishkeit. Well, it has an enormous amount for Jews, certainly, but it has an enormous amount for all of us really to recuperate a lot of what has been lost. Whether it needs to assume a specific political form, I don't know, and someone else should determine. Jack Jacob is more than anyone else, me to a tiny extent, tried to recreate a sort of youth Bund in the very first years of the current century. And I don't know why it wasn't successful. It was one of those great ideas that didn't happen. Could it happen tomorrow? Would it be a way of rejoining the international connections between Jews across the planet in a socialistic way, which brought back the memories of the past, and also put a little stress on people learning Yiddish, struggling to learn Yiddish, like myself, having been much more fluent 40 years ago and struggling back to learn it again, but get a feeling of what that culture has to present. There has not been any vision of socialism, that is to say, a society beyond the power of capital or state capital. There hasn't been any vision better than the Bund. So is it important for that Bund sensibility to infuse any socialistic movement or progressive movement? Yes, absolutely so. And I probably neglected to say, but Sharon and Michael have seen this, the joy of the countryside, the belief in the power of nature. These are very big things for the Bund, and can be understood. Their importance can be understood better today than socialists and communists, more scientific-minded, could possibly have grasped in their more narrow sensibilities 130 years ago.
Thank you so much. So we've reached the point, the hours point, and so what I'm going to say is two things. First, I want to thank the three of you for being with us, and thank you for doing this. Really, this is a unique book that I frankly just would not have expected. And it was a delight when I found out that that you had put this together. So thank you for joining us and sharing from the book. I do want to mention there were some questions about buying it. It's a little complicated in that somebody said they were in Canada. You can buy it from the, I mean, there are multiple places in Canada, but including the publisher, but between two lines. In the United States, it's more complicated. You can get it through, I'll provide the link, but AK Press sells it domestically. You can buy it online. You can't purchase it easily through some of the more popular booksellers. And
hope that will improve.
Okay, good. I'm going to go ahead and what I'm going to do is unconventionally, because I know there are some people here who do have some Bundist background, and including people who grew up in schools and the movements. And so anybody who'd like, I think that we're going to conclude our official program here, and anybody who would like to stay on and converse further is welcome to stay on in a more informal manner. Just for the rare opportunity to have folks together, and I'll enable people to unmute themselves to talk. So officially, we're going to end. Is there anything that you would like to leave us with, either of you, Paul, Michael, or Sharon?
I'd just like to thank you for having us on and giving us a chance to tell you about the book.
I guess what I would say, from my own experience with graphic novels, which is now considerable, is that a lot of these are sold to grandparents who give them to their grandchildren. After all, young people start reading graphic novels when they're 12 or 13 years old. So it's a sort of ideal way to plunge into this field. And if they like it, if it's important, they can find scholarly books by Jack Jacobs and others. But it's a starter manual on understanding the importance of the Bund and its role within Jewish history.
Great, thank you. And with so I think we're gonna and we will be sending out an email message tomorrow to everybody who registered, and it will have a link to the books that were mentioned by Paul and others to further your reading as well. Everybody, and be well, and let's all hope for the best in our very difficult world right now.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks, everybody. So long.
Bye-bye.